welcome back to Crypto Bits. I'm your host, Brittany, and today we have Mr. Stefan Matthews joining us. Hello, Stefan. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Pretty good, and hello from Manila, the Philippines.
Nice. Do you think you could start us off by telling us briefly a little bit about yourself and how you began your journey into Bitcoin?
Sure. I might start with present day and then do a complete backflip to the beginning.
Okay.
Today, I am the CEO and executive chairman of TAL. And TAL is a public company, shares traded on the Canadian Securities Exchange. I'm also executive chairman of the nChain group, which I was involved in founding in 2015. And I sit on the executive committee, which is essentially the board of the Bitcoin Association for BSV. So I have a pretty full dance card when it comes to things that are happening in the ecosystem, the BSV ecosystem these days. But now I'll flip back to the very beginning, and I guess the intention of your question, if I'm so presumptuous, is to get right back to the very beginning of pre-Bitcoin and when I met Craig. Would that be true?
Yes, sir. Yes, please.
Yeah. In 2005, I was working as the CIO of a company that was planning for a public listing on the Australian Stock Exchange. And I had engaged BDO to perform a security audit and a control systems audit. We were an online gambling business that had a long history in sports betting, regulated and licensed by the Northern Territory government in Australia. Actually, we also held licenses issued by the UK Gaming Commission and the Maltese regulator. So, it was across all those jurisdictions. But we engaged BDO to do this audit, and when the partner arrived in my office and we sat down in the boardroom, and he introduced his team. One of the people that he introduced on his team was Craig Stephen Wright, and of course Craig was, as Craig is dressed today, sitting there in a beautiful three-piece suit and a tie, but he didn't wear red socks in those days. If you're interested. But he was part of the three-man team that were going to do the review, and he was the senior. So he led the work. So he and the other two guys spent a lot of time in the office. Craig didn't, during the audit, Craig didn't spend a lot of time with me personally. Obviously, he did from time to time have questions and interviews with me, but he spent more time with my team that looked after networks and infrastructure and security. But the audit finished, and then we got on to the, what do you do when you have an audit? You normally have an audit letter, and it's got a number of remediation points that you either decide that you're going to deal with or you're not going to deal with. And in most cases, you deal with them because it's in your best interest to do so. So we went through a period of 6 or 9 months where we did work, and then obviously we asked BDO to come back in and review and check that what we had dealt with had been dealt with sufficiently. And ultimately in 2006, we listed as a public company on the Australian Stock Exchange. But Craig continued to be the main point of contact between my company and BDO, mainly because he was the audit lead and he was based in Sydney. The partner that Craig reported to was based in Melbourne in Australia. So we didn't have the opportunity to meet face to face very often with him being remote. And during that period, Craig started to spend more and more time with me. Now, if you've followed Craig or you have ever met him, have you ever met him, by the way?
I have not had the pleasure yet, but soon. Would love to.
he's an interesting bloke because he sometimes, actually more often than not, has complete disregard to his surroundings or the protocol that might exist in the surroundings. And by that, I could be sitting in my office, and I was sitting in my office many, many times, and Craig would walk into the building and I could see to the far end, because I had an office with a glass face, and I could see the entire open plan floor, and I could see the doors at the other end, and you'd see movement down there, and you'd look up, and bear in mind, we had about 85 people on that floor. So through the maze of people, you could see Craig making his way down. Most guys were wearing T-shirts and jeans and whatever. We're a sports betting organization, and here's Craig in his three-piece suit. So he stood out. So he'd make his way down, and I could be sitting in my office with 2 or 3 people having a meeting. And Craig would just open the door, walk in and say hi and sit down on a chair. And I go, mate, I'm in the middle of a meeting here. And he goes, oh, don't worry about me, just carry on. It doesn't work like that. Like, off you go and go out there, and I'll let you know when I'm finished. Oh, okay. He never took offense at that, by the way. To him, that was just, all quite natural. So, more often than not, that was the case. And when he did get to talk to me, he used to spend more time talking about ideas and concepts that he had for a whole variety of things, e-cash, e-gold, electronic this, and I don't know why he chose to talk to me about these things, but he did. And he was asking for what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on that? What if I had electronic gold with gold in vaults in Switzerland? And then they dropped that idea, and he went on to something else. But the whole time it was about electronic money, and this went on for, I would say, from late 2006, definitely through 2007, and a lot through 2008. I mean, he ended up leaving BDO in the fourth quarter of 2008, and of course there were a lot of interesting things happened in the fourth quarter of 2008. One of the things that happened was the white paper was published. Obviously, he was very heavily involved in code and testing and preparations, because he launched Bitcoin in January 2009, 9th of January 2009. But he continued this practice of popping in and seeing me to run ideas past me. He wanted to do some really interesting security related development on our networks to prove out some theory that ultimately ended up being incorporated in some part in Bitcoin, and that work, I believe, has subsequently found its way or been found to be in papers and material that he presented to universities around various security subjects as well. But he really wanted me to be involved actively with him in some way in this project. And I had no interest. I mean, at that point in time, I had a very, very busy job. We were doing a lot of boardroom presentations where the company was in discussions with multiple public companies in Europe who were looking at buying us, taking us over as an entry point to get into the Australian market, because the Australian market was very, very strong in sports betting activity and returns. So, I would, having a C-level position, I was involved quite actively in those discussions and building presentations and delivering them and so forth. So I didn't have enough. I had a day job as well. I had to run a business that was being hunted as an acquisition target. So we needed, if we were going to get significant value out of that, we needed to run a proper business as well. So Craig was pretty low on my my attention list during the latter part of 2008. And to be honest, when he came to me, he actually gave me a copy of the white paper sometime before it was published. And I've spoken to Craig about this subsequently, and he's informed me that, you know, he's very meticulous. He informed me that it was the second last revision of the white paper before the final version that was published. And I've been asked 100 times, oh, do you have a copy of it? Well, the way he gave it to me was on a USB stick. And I'm not a heavy social media user. You know, if I use anything, it's LinkedIn, but outside of that, no, purely because I just get too much shit that comes down the pipe, you know, and you just get sick of it. So you go, I either don't do it or you close the account. But I've been asked, what happened to the USB stick? You must still have it. Well, I've said in multiple interviews, if people care to listen to them, and I hope they listen to yours, he gives me this USB stick. That's a USB stick, by the way. He gives me a USB stick. I stick it in to my drive. I drag the only file that was on it onto my desktop, and I give it back to him. So for the people who write stuff on Twitter that people send to me and say, oh, have you seen this? You know, where they say, well, you know, if Matthews was serious, he'd produce the USB stick. Well, I am serious, and I don't have the bloody USB stick because I gave it back to the man while he was sitting in front of me. Anyway, I dragged it onto my desktop, and he said, aren't you going to read it? And I said, no, mate, I'll you know, read it in due course. So off he went, and I actually did print the thing. I had a printer in my office next to me because I had a lot of sensitive material that I didn't want out in, you know, on the general floor. So I always printed my documents locally in my office, and I did print the white paper. And I did that because I don't know whether it's just me or whether I'm old school or what. I hate reading documents on screen. Obviously, I'll read emails on screen. If they're short documents, I don't mind reading them on screen, like one page. But if I've got to read something that's multiple pages, I like to have it in paper so I can scribble notes in it. And more often than not, if you're reading lengthy documents, you want to refer back to a previous page or two previous pages to check something, or there's a reference. So that's why I don't like the on-screen viewing. Anyway, I read this thing. I must admit, not in full. I certainly read the abstract, and I started reading and flipping through the pages, and then I put it aside and I formed the opinion, not interested. So Craig came back to my office at some stage and saw the document laying there, and he go, oh, you read the white paper, what do you think of it? And I said, mate, if I have to be completely honest, I said, this won't be successful. In fact, you know, as far as I'm concerned, it's the greatest load of fucking rubbish that I've ever seen. But, you know, please don't take offense. Oh, no, it's okay. You're entitled to your opinion. And, you know, it was like he just took that and walked off and was perfectly fine. But the next time he came back and talked to me about Bitcoin was, I'm going to say, around about April 2009. And he came in and he said to me, oh, by the way, I've launched my project, and it's working. And I said, what project are you talking about? He goes, Bitcoin. I went, Craig, I'm not interested in talking about this. I thought I've already expressed my views on it. And he said, yeah, but mate, can you give me $500? I said, what do you want $500 for? Are you short? And he said, no, I'm not short. Just give me 500 and I'll give you 50,000 Bitcoin. I said, I've already told you, I'm not interested in this shit. Now, it's only been the last, I'm going to say 9 months, that I've started talking about the 50,000 Bitcoin.
Right.
And the reason I hadn't previously is because I kind of figured it wasn't important.
That was one of the That was one of the things
Yeah.
I was going to ask you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Was
No.
it's almost like you've known that Craig was Satoshi this entire time. So, some people will ask, well, if you knew that he was Satoshi, who did you tell before? Why does it only feel like just now we're hearing that you believed Craig was Satoshi? And from what you're saying, it's like, well, I didn't see it as an issue because it was just known that he was Satoshi.
Well, it wasn't important for me until 2015. And but prior to that, I had told members of my family about, some parts of this. Obviously, when things started to become more, the topic started to become more active in my life in 2015, late 2014, early 2015, more close friends started to sit down and talk to me. And I was never anything but completely open in my discussions with them. A couple of people who worked with me back in 2005 through 2009 in Sydney, I've had private discussions with them, and they've mentioned to me that Craig, one-on-one had similar conversations with some of those to what he had with me. He didn't offer 50,000 Bitcoin, but and he didn't show them the white paper, but he certainly had discussions with them about his project and his philosophies and his ideas. So I wasn't the only person he spoke to. So Craig and I kind of like parted company at the end of 2009. He was obviously off doing other things and working on his project, and then leaving his project and setting up whatever he ended up with in Australia. And I moved to London. The company that I was with did end up being acquired by a public company in the UK. And on the day of change of control, I submitted my resignation and moved to the UK to take up a different role. And I did that not because there was any animosity, but it was purely because I sat there and thought, and I was considered to be a key employee in the acquisition, and I thought, if I subscribe to this, I've been doing what I've been doing for nearly 12, 14 years. And for me, it wasn't a reason to get out of bed anymore. Yeah, it was a paycheck, but it was routine. And I just didn't want to sit there for another 10 or 15 years being a routine person. That's not who I am. So I was approached actually, sometime before the change of control occurred, and I was very honest with the people who approached me that I wasn't in a position where I could leave or even make a decision to leave until change of control occurred. But nonetheless, I thought about it and I made the decision that I was going to take up this offer and move to the UK. So Craig and I went through a period of, until late 2014, I hadn't heard from him since 2010. But he had a lot of communication with at least two people that used to report to me in Sydney. One of those people I had ultimately offered a job in London, and he had moved to the UK as well. But I was only in the UK for about 18 months, and then I moved to the Philippines. The company had significant operations in the Philippines, and there were structures offered by the Filipino government around regional office headquarters and expats moving to the Philippines, and highly beneficial tax arrangements, both for the expat and for the company to do that. So I ultimately moved with a couple of senior guys to Manila. But I did get a couple of calls from London from my colleague to say that, you know, could he engage Craig in some forensic work? And I was going, yeah, you can do that, but you're responsible for it. You know, I'm approving the expense, but you know, I don't need to be involved. So Craig and I just didn't cross paths until late 2014, early 2015, somewhere in that range. My mobile phone rang on my desk in Manila, and unknown number, picked it up, and it was Craig Wright. And I went, how'd you get this number? And he said, from person X in London. Okay, thank you. I said, what can I do for you? And he said, I got a few problems here in Australia and I need some advice. And I've thought about this, and the single person who I figure will understand and give me sensible advice and who I trust is you. And of course, as soon as someone says that, I was like, you know, you can feel the rope tightening around your neck. And I said, yeah, okay, listen, for whatever, I've got some personal reasons why I have to go to Australia in the next 3 or 4 weeks. I need to sign some documents in person in Sydney. So when I come down, let's catch up and have a meeting. So that's what happened. I stayed at the Holiday Inn at Sydney Airport. I went into the city. I did the work that I needed to do with my lawyers, and then went back to the hotel and met Craig for lunch, or thinking I was meeting Craig for lunch.
He wasn't there?
No, he was there, but he brought 2 other dudes with him. And these 2 guys, I was kind of like, I wasn't told. It was, I just drew the conclusion that they were working with Craig. They were part of his team in Sydney. But I later found out that, you know, the team in Sydney, apart from he and Ramona, had all been stood down, and the companies were, you know, that close to being folded because they had no cash. And there's a lot of reasons why that was the case, and the Australian Tax Office was one of the reasons. But these 2 guys had been working with Craig and were very loyal to Craig, and I found out probably in about July or August 2015, they both sat there and openly told me that Craig was Satoshi Nakamoto. And I went, oh, really? Do you think so? So I said, boys, let me tell you a story. So I told them my story, and they just went, oh, okay. So you believe too? I said, well, I don't believe.
I know.
I know. So one thing led to another, and I actually, during the process that I went through when I was talking to Craig about his problems and issues, I'm a very good friend of Calvin's, as you probably are aware, Calvin Ayre, and I went back to Manila after meeting Craig, and I sat at my home and I thought, I need to talk to someone about this, because, you know, I'd had a full download from Craig about the state of his companies and what he'd been doing since 2010 through to 2014. How many people? I mean, he had 45 people working for him, you know, up on the North Shore in Sydney. And, you know, when I went in to see his office for the first time, it was eerie, because I walked in and it was like this massive office with all, you know, 45 desks, 50 desks in it, and computers on each desk, laptops on each desk, 2 screens, papers, pencils, staplers, you know, the whole works. And it was like someone blew a whistle and everyone just went, put everything down where it sat, and walked out and never came back. So you walk around and all these desks look like someone got up from them last night. but there'd be no one there for months. It was really quite strange. And the place was filled with documents. There was a storage room that was full of lever arch files with collated white papers and research material. And I do have a recollection of a colleague of mine that I bought to help me do some due diligence in May 2015. In that room, he came out and he said, "You got to come and have a look at this." And I went in there and I said, "What am I looking at?" And he goes, "That." I said, "It's a white paper." And he goes, "No, have a look at the date on it." This set of notes, you know, I just described it as a white paper, but it was a half white paper, half set of research notes on a particular topic related to blockchain. And it was from 2006.
A lot earlier.
So you can imagine what was in this room. And I'm saying the room would have been, you know, 4 meters by 3 meters, and it had shelving floor to ceiling both sides, and it was fucking full of files, absolutely full of files. I mean, it'd take a man 3 years to read them all. So, and then there was other filing cabinets and stuff just all around the office, just full of material. So through that period, you know, where was I? I was about to tell you that I phoned Calvin. I was back in preceding seeing all these files. I was sitting there and I went, I just need to talk to someone. And I thought, fuck it, I'll call Calvin because he's, you know, a mate and he'll listen to me and, you know, talk me off the ledge. So I called him and I said, listen, mate, I got something I need to talk through with you. I need your thoughts and some help on getting my thoughts straight. And he said, "Oh shit, this doesn't sound good." I said, no, there's nothing sinister or bad here. It's just, I need you to sit down because I've got to tell you a story. So I told him my history with Craig. Well, first of all, I said to him, "Have you ever heard of Bitcoin?" And he said, "Yeah, I have. I've done a bit of reading about Bitcoin and sort of looked at it." And I thought that was a natural thing because, you know, both of us, you know, were heavily involved in the gambling industry. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons, because people used to say to me, why do you think Craig openly spoke to you or singled you out to talk to in 2007, 2008? And I've never asked him, or maybe I should, but I've always felt that it was because he had a history of doing things in the gambling industry with casinos and sports books. He did that work for me at Centerbet. One of the most important things in online gaming or gambling is your ability to move money in and out. And therefore, you know, a lot of the schemes that he was talking to me about electronic cash, electronic gold, digital cash solutions preceding the white paper, he always sort of related them to the industry I was in and the company I was working for, and wanted to know whether not only myself, but the company might be interested in seeing some of the stuff that he was working on. And, you know, I always said, no, they're not. No, I'm not. But that's the nexus. That's why I think of all the people Craig could have talked to about his ideas that eventually resulted in the formation of Bitcoin, why he chose to talk to me, because he probably felt that I was more likely to understand the value of electronic cash than most other people from a business setting, from a use case perspective. So anyway, back to the call with Calvin. I told him the story, And there was silence on the phone. Oh, first I said, "Do you know who invented Bitcoin?" He goes, "Oh no, I don't. Oh, wasn't it some Japanese guy?" So then I told him the story, and there was silence. And I said, "Mate, are you there?" And he goes, "Yeah, this is a lot to digest. Can I sort of think about this? Can we have a call tomorrow?" I went, "Yeah, sure." So that's what we did. We had a call the next day, and what happened from there, he asked me a lot of questions about Craig. And I said, the best thing for us to do here, if you're interested, and I'd like you to be interested, but if you're interested, I think Craig and I should fly over to Vancouver, which is where Calvin was at the time. And you should meet him face to face and form your own opinion. And that's what happened. I flew from Manila and Craig flew from Sydney, and we met in Vancouver and on a Sunday, and then I introduced him to Calvin on the Monday. And I think we had 2 days of meetings, and then I flew back to Manila, Craig flew back to Sydney. But, Calvin has spoken publicly a few times about the meeting that occurred at his penthouse on the roof in Vancouver, where Craig and I and he talked about the problems with BTC and, how the industry, how Bitcoin should and could be saved. And that's true. What we talked about wasn't investment. It wasn't how to save or restructure Craig's companies in Australia. It was more general industry stuff around where Bitcoin had lost its way and what Craig's original vision and views were, and what is, if he had total control of things, how would Bitcoin look today, and how should it look today, and why? And it was those types of discussions, and that obviously resonated incredibly well with Calvin, because he struck up an incredible friendship with Craig, and they, over the years, have become very close in terms of the way they talk to each other and what the things are that they discuss and talk about. But aside from that, I set up the formation of nChain and the acquisition of intellectual property, and Craig's own intellectual property into the nChain group. And I did that in the second half of, we struck a deal in June 2015, and then I spent a lot of time in Australia in the second half of 2015 executing against that deal. And I worked for about 6 months with Baker and McKenzie in Sydney, and about at least 6 lawyers, and sometimes it was up to 12 or 15 lawyers, just to be able to fully understand the corporate structure, the intellectual property that existed in the corporate structure, what the relationships between the entities were, and what the web of intellectual property looked like, who owned it, who the shareholders were, and so on and so forth. And then obviously Baker's, with their practice in the UK, worked with me as well, and we set up a whole intellectual property holding company offshore and a research center in the UK. And then the deal that we had in June of 2015 was that Craig and his family would relocate to London in October 2015, and Craig and I were in London around about September, October. I know Ramona went over separately to look at houses and so forth, but things didn't move as fast as we wanted. And then the plan was that they were relocating just before Christmas in 2015. But we had, when I say we, Craig wasn't involved, but others were with me. We selected an office in London, took a lease on the office, agreed on what the fit out was going to be. And Craig and I actually interviewed people in October 2015, who a couple of them ended up accepting job offers and came to Australia in December 2015 to get some tutorial work from Craig before they went back to the UK for Christmas. But I can remember the nChain office in January 2015. We had 6 people, and we moved into the office. There was no ceiling, there was no air conditioning, there was no internet. There were a couple of tables, and we sat there with our laptops and our mobile phones using hotspots to actually do work. And we moved the location of the tables around the office as the construction team was starting to, build the office. So over about a 2-month period, the office got built. And by the time it got built, we had about 15 people, I think, sitting in there, and that grew to 45, 50 people by the time we were 18 months old. And it was kind of funny. We used to talk about the fact that we had a research centre in central London, and we had all these PhD scientists, researchers sitting in there. And I remember people coming to me with things that were posted on social media saying, this is impossible, it's bullshit, it's all lies, it's smoke and mirrors. Nobody could hire that many PhDs in central London without anyone knowing about it. Nobody could have an office like that in central London without it being visible. Well, it was. It was in Oxford Circus, and we're on the 5th floor of a building that had just been renovated. And it was kind of funny because in the lobby, when you come in, there's a directory and there's a receptionist sitting there, and it was a security building, so you had to swipe to get in, or the receptionist had to verify who you were to come in. And there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up it goes, and it went to 6 or 6 floors, and it had tenants name on 1, tenant's name on 2, 3, 4, and 6, and level 5 it had to let. To let. So our name wasn't even for 3 years. Our name wasn't even on the directory in the lobby, and the reason for that, of course, was privacy. It was no more than that. We didn't want people. I mean, there was a lot of shit going on in late 2015 and through 2016, and we didn't want people to be harassed and hounded as they were coming in and out of the office to go to work and all that sort of stuff. So, but it worked very effectively. It worked really, really, really well.
Sometimes the best way to hide is just in plain sight.
Yeah. It's like I read stuff. We'd all be sitting in the office. There'd be 25 of us in the office, and someone would read out something about this is obviously a lie. It's impossible, and we're all laughing at each other, drinking cups of coffee in the morning. And then, of course, I left. I was the CEO of nChain for the first couple of years, and during those years, the nChain purpose was purely research. We had a small engineering team, but that was more to do proof of concept stuff around research topics, to be able to verify that the research solutions that were coming out of research were able to be implemented from a practical perspective and prove them out. So that was the embryo of what exists today. I mean, nChain is a far different business today. I mean, we have 270 people, and only 35 of those or 30 of those work in research. The rest of them are in various roles that in some way or another relate to the development of software and solutions and platforms on these days BSV. But the interesting thing was that for a hell of a long time, and to a degree, some of the stuff today that is dealt with in research is blockchain agnostic. Everyone used to say that nChain was wedded at the hip to a specific blockchain, whether it be BCH or BSV ultimately. The research wasn't structured that way. The research was really blockchain agnostic. However, you know, the purpose of the business was very definitely focused on a particular blockchain solution, and that's just the way it is. But a lot of the research people would be interested to know is actually agnostic.
That is quite
and
interesting.
Of course, yeah. And then you know, it was fascinating for me because I'd gone through this fucking process in Australia with Baker and McKenzie to assess and document and transfer at value, arm's length, all this intellectual property from all these bloody companies under that De Morgan umbrella into the nChain group. And the, you know, the enormous number of papers that nChain has put out and the enormous number of patent applications that have been filed, very, very few, and when I'm saying very, very few, single digit percentages have got any nexus at all to the intellectual property that essentially was the foundation of nChain. And we started off with this enormous funnel of concepts, half-written papers and research documents, which was a huge number. It was reported once in the press that nChain had a funnel of 400 or 450 titles. And at the time, that was true. How they found that out in 2016, I don't know, but they did. But I can tell you that that funnel is even larger than that today by factors, right? And yet, during the years, so much has been completed, so much has been filed, so many applications have been filed with the UK Patent Office and others. So the amount of ideas and the amount of intellectual property which is funneling through the whole nChain environment is enormous. And of course, you know, the challenge that the board has made to the nChain group in recent times is, you know, you need to commercialize at some point or another. And of course, the concept that came out of that about 2.5 years ago was kensai. And the kensai platform, which is really a piece of, I'll call it middleware, that will enable pretty simple adaptation of the BSV blockchain for businesses and enterprise to be able to connect without significant re-engineering of their current solutions. Now that sounds, you know, pretty idealistic and fanciful, but that was the original idea, and that is what we believe nChain has produced in the kensai platform. I mean, it's a modular solution, so not every user or enterprise will use the entire suite of capabilities of kensai, but you know, it'll be a selection of these modules that will come together to form the core of a solution that suits A or B or C. And then there'll be other modules developed around industry solutions that will become part of kensai over time. So it's an embryonic thing which will grow massively over the next few years and enable as an enablement layer for industries and enterprise grade clients to attach to the network. And then of course the other side of that is Tal.
Tal.
And I want to talk to you about Tal,
I want
because
to talk about Tal too.
on your program recently, there's been some incredible misinformation and misstatements that I want to correct.
Yes, please.
If I may.
And that is going to wrap it up for part 1 of our interview here with Stefan Matthews. Make sure to join us for part 2, and we'll see you next time.